Sister Agnes arrived in the town of Hollow Creek on a gray autumn morning when the air smelled of damp leaves and old promises. The convent stood on a hill above the town, its stone walls weathered by decades of prayer, silence, and unspoken rules. To the townspeople, it was a place of holiness and order. To Agnes, stepping through its iron gates for the first time, it felt like stepping into a life she believed had been chosen for her by God himself. She was 27, younger than most of the sisters, and carried with her a quiet intensity that came from years of devotion rather than rebellion. Agnes had grown up believing faith was an act of love, not fear, and obedience was meant to guide the soul, not erase it. Her vows were sincere: poverty, chastity, obedience. She spoke them with a steady voice, unaware of how differently those words were practiced inside Hollow Creek's convent. From the first weeks, she noticed the hierarchy. The abbess answered to the bishop. The bishop answered to men who never walked the convent halls yet dictated its rhythm. The sisters answered to everyone. Decisions about food, schedules, work assignments, even medical care came from male authority outside the walls. Inside, the rules were enforced by silence, routine, and the constant reminder that questioning was a form of pride. Agnes worked in the infirmary. She cleaned wounds, measured medicine, and prayed with sisters whose bodies had grown frail from years of labor and fasting. She listened to whispered complaints late at night, confessions that never reached the confessional. Women who spoke of exhaustion, of being ignored when they were ill, of punishment disguised as discipline. Agnes listened and felt something tighten inside her chest. This was not what she had imagined service would look like. At meals, the priests ate separately, served warm food, and spoke freely. The sisters ate last, often in silence, their portions smaller, their eyes lowered. When Agnes once asked why the food for the infirm sisters had been reduced, the abbess corrected her gently but firmly. Sacrifice, she said, was pleasing to God. Agnes nodded, but the words rang hollow. The first time she spoke openly was during a meeting about labor assignments. An elderly sister had collapsed while scrubbing floors, yet was ordered back to work the next day. Agnes suggested a rotation, something humane, something sustainable. The room went still. The abbess stared at her, not with anger, but with disappointment, a dangerous emotion in a place built on approval. Agnes was reminded of her vow of obedience and dismissed. Word traveled quickly in Hollow Creek. The convent was the town's moral center. The priests advised local leaders, blessed businesses, settled disputes. When Agnes began to ask questions inside the walls, the answers came from outside. A priest visited the infirmary and warned her kindly that change came slowly and only through proper channels. Hollow Creek, he said, was not the place for disruption. Agnes prayed harder. She fasted longer. She searched Scripture for reassurance that compassion was not rebellion. But each small act of concern was met with quiet correction. She was reassigned from the infirmary to the laundry, then to the gardens. Isolation disguised as reflection. The sisters she once helped were told not to confide in her. Silence thickened around her like fog. Still, she tried. She wrote letters to the diocese describing conditions without accusation, only concern. She suggested training for sisters providing medical care. She asked for rest days for the elderly. None of the letters were answered. One was returned, unopened. Outside the convent walls, Hollow Creek remained unchanged. The town trusted the church implicitly. When rumors began that a young nun was causing unrest, people shook their heads. Ungrateful, some said. Confused, others whispered. A woman who did not know her place. Agnes felt the weight of that phrase every day. Her place. Defined not by her calling, but by her silence. She began to understand that the system did not need cruelty to survive. It needed compliance. And compliance was taught early, rewarded often, and enforced when necessary. Late at night, alone in her cell, Agnes wondered if holiness required suffering without question, or if true faith demanded courage. She did not doubt God. She doubted the structure built in His name. And in Hollow Creek, doubt was far more dangerous than sin. By the end of her first year, Agnes was known. Not as a healer, not as a devoted sister, but as a problem. The city had not yet turned its back on her, but it had begun to look away. And in a place where everything depended on being seen, invisibility was the first punishment. The convent bells still rang the same, marking hours that felt increasingly rigid, but something inside Agnes had shifted. She watched younger novices arrive with bright eyes and leave their first months already subdued, their laughter trimmed away like excess cloth. She saw how correction was delivered softly, almost lovingly, which made it harder to resist. No one shouted, no one struck. The system was cleaner than that. It relied on guilt, on spiritual language used as restraint, on the fear of being labeled unfaithful. Agnes sensed that her struggle was only beginning. She had not yet challenged the city, not openly, not publicly, but the walls were listening, and so were the people beyond them. Every refusal to break her spirit made her stand out more. Every attempt to remain compassionate marked her as disobedient. Hollow Creek did not crush resistance quickly. It allowed it to exist just long enough to isolate itself. And somewhere between prayer and exhaustion, Agnes realized she would have to choose what kind of silence she could live with. The convent would continue as it always had, but her conscience would not, and that quiet conflict would soon spill beyond stone walls into a town, unprepared to listen and respond kindly. Winter arrived early in Hollow Creek, pressing cold against the convent walls and hardening routines already stiff with habit. Agnes felt the season change inside her as well, a tightening that prayer alone no longer loosened. She was watched more closely now, corrected for small things, reminded often of humility. The abbess spoke kindly, always kindly. But kindness became another form of discipline. Agnes learned that concern sounded like defiance when spoken by a woman. Each day passed with careful steps, measured words, and the knowledge that any misstep would be remembered long after obedience was forgotten by everyone present. Her reassignment to the gardens seemed harmless to outsiders, but Agnes understood the message clearly. Distance was correction. Physical labor replaced listening, soil instead of sickbeds. She worked from dawn until evening, hands cracked, knees aching, watched by older sisters trained to report irregularities. Conversations stopped when she approached. Meals grew quieter. Letters from home were delayed. The convent did not exile openly. It narrowed the world until resistance had nowhere to breathe. Agnes prayed among the frozen rows, asking whether endurance without voice was truly virtue or merely another sanctioned form of spiritual erasure within the institution itself daily. The town's attitude shifted subtly, like frost spreading across glass. When Agnes accompanied the sisters into Hollow Creek, for errands, conversations cooled. Shopkeepers offered polite smiles without warmth. Parishioners avoided her eyes. Sermons began emphasizing obedience, order, and the dangers of pride. Agnes recognized herself in every cautionary phrase. Once, a woman pressed a folded note into her hand, then quickly withdrew, fear overtaking concern. The note contained only a single sentence, trembling in ink, thanking her for seeing what others refused to name inside a town trained to protect silence over. Justice at all costs, without question, ever again. Within the convent, pressure increased without announcement. Agnes was excluded from meetings, prayers reassigned, duties changed without explanation. Her requests to return to the infirmary were denied with smiles. The abbess spoke of patience, of spiritual growth through acceptance. Agnes listened respectfully, yet felt the slow violence of erasure. When she knelt in the chapel, she sensed eyes upon her, measuring devotion by compliance. The sisters learned caution from her treatment, absorbing the lesson quietly. Survival required submission, and submission required forgetting oneself completely within the institution that claimed moral authority over their lives daily, without appeal or recourse ever. Agnes began keeping a private journal, hidden beneath loose floorboards in her cell. She wrote carefully, aware discovery would mean consequences she could not predict. The pages held observations, names, dates, and small injustices that accumulated like sediment. Writing became her resistance, her proof that reality existed beyond sanctioned narratives. She did not imagine exposure yet. She wrote to remember herself. Each word preserved a version of truth that the convent insisted did not exist, a fragile defense against the gaslighting of holiness practiced daily through rituals designed to silence dissent quietly and permanently within sacred spaces only outwardly revered. Spring approached, but no thaw reached Agnes's standing. A visiting bishop toured the convent, praised discipline, and spoke of unity. Agnes was instructed to remain in the gardens during his visit. From a distance, she watched authority bless obedience and mistake silence for peace. That evening, the abbess informed her that her letters had been deemed unnecessary. Guidance, she said, must come from above. Agnes recognized the finality in her tone. The system had closed ranks, protecting itself with practiced serenity while dissent was. Reframed as spiritual immaturity requiring correction, not conversation or mercy ever again within Hollow Creek permanently. One night, Sister Margaret collapsed in the dormitory, her breathing shallow, her face pale. Agnes acted instinctively, ignoring protocol, calling for help, demanding a doctor. She stayed beside Margaret until dawn. The response was swift. Agnes was reprimanded for overstepping authority. The infirmary remained closed to her. Margaret survived, but was transferred days later, removed quietly. Agnes understood then that compassion threatened order. Saving a life mattered less than preserving hierarchy, and obedience outweighed responsibility in Hollow Creek's sacred arithmetic, enforced daily by men unseen yet unquestioned within the town's moral imagination and institutional memory for generations, unchallenged publicly ever. Sleep abandoned Agnes. Doubt visited nightly, not about faith, but about endurance. She wondered how long one could remain holy while enabling harm through silence. Leaving was unthinkable. Staying felt increasingly complicit. The journal grew heavier beneath the floorboards. She began to sense that her struggle was no longer personal. It reflected every woman trained to shrink herself for peace. Hollow Creek was not unique. It was merely honest about who held power and who absorbed consequence without protest or recognition within institutions claiming divine endorsement and moral superiority over others' lives endlessly, justified as tradition, sacred law itself unquestioned. The town council announced a festival celebrating Hollow Creek's history, centered on the convent. Agnes was forbidden from attending. Flyers praised harmony and devotion. Children rehearsed hymns. The city prepared to celebrate an image untouched by truth. Agnes realized then that any attempt to change the system from within would be erased publicly. Reform threatened reputation. Reputation mattered more than justice. Hollow Creek would protect its symbols at any cost, even if that meant sacrificing the women who sustained them through invisible labor prayer and obedience demanded but rarely acknowledged or rewarded with dignity or autonomy ever again publicly acknowledged. By summer, Agnes understood that patience would not redeem the system. Silence would not soften it. Her efforts had been absorbed, neutralized, redirected into warning signs for others. Yet something irreversible had occurred. She could no longer unsee the machinery of control. Her faith remained intact, sharpened even, but stripped of illusion. The city had begun turning its back on her, and soon she would face a choice that could no longer be postponed without consequence for herself, the convent, and a town unwilling to confront truths buried beneath ritual, authority, and fear of meaningful change ever again publicly admitted. By the time summer fully settled over Hollow Creek, Agnes understood that visibility had become her greatest liability. The convent no longer needed to punish her openly. Her isolation did the work efficiently. Younger sisters were warned through example. Older ones avoided her out of fear or exhaustion. The abbess spoke to her rarely now, and when she did, it was with a tone reserved for lost causes, gentle and distant, as if Agnes were already halfway gone. The system had decided she was uncorrectable, which meant she was no longer worth engaging. Agnes noticed how the town mirrored the convent's behavior perfectly. When she walked through Hollow Creek, she was neither confronted nor comforted. She was simply passed over. Neighbors who once nodded now stared through her. The bakery stopped saving bread for the sisters. Children whispered when she passed. The silence followed her everywhere, heavy and intentional. It was not anger she felt from the town, but agreement. Agreement with those who had labeled her troublesome, prideful, ungrateful. Agreement that whatever discomfort existed inside the convent was not theirs to question. Her journal grew more urgent. Agnes began recording not just events, but patterns. How women who complied were praised publicly and drained privately. How discipline was framed as spiritual care. How men spoke of sacrifice while never practicing it. How authority remained invisible yet absolute. She wrote about Sister Margaret, about the infirmary, about the letters returned unopened. Each entry felt dangerous but necessary. She no longer wrote, only to preserve her sanity. She wrote because she sensed the truth might die if she did not give it a body. One afternoon, Agnes was summoned to the parlor. A priest from the diocese sat across from her, hands folded, expression calm. He spoke at length about concern for her spiritual well-being. He asked if she felt overwhelmed, if perhaps her zeal had clouded her judgment. He never mentioned her actions directly. The language was careful, rehearsed. Agnes answered honestly, calmly, refusing to apologize for compassion. The priest nodded, thanked her, and reminded her that humility was the highest virtue for a servant of God. The conversation ended without resolution, which told her everything she needed to know. That evening, the abbess informed Agnes that her journal had been discovered during a routine inspection. The words landed without accusation, only disappointment. Agnes felt the floor tilt beneath her. The abbess held the book as one might hold a fragile object, dangerous not because of its weight, but because of what it contained. She asked Agnes why she felt the need to document her sisters instead of trusting leadership. Agnes answered quietly that trust required accountability. The abbess closed the journal and said nothing more. The punishment came slowly. Agnes was restricted from communal prayer. Her meals were taken alone. Her duties were reduced to cleaning storage rooms no one used. The convent framed it as rest, reflection, mercy. Agnes recognized it as erasure. She was no longer meant to influence anyone. She was meant to fade. When she knelt alone in the chapel, the silence no longer felt holy. It felt strategic, designed. News of her restriction spread through Hollow Creek, though no one spoke of it openly. The festival passed without her presence. Photos appeared in the local paper celebrating unity and faith. The convent gleamed. The town applauded itself. Agnes watched from the margins, understanding now that the city's loyalty was not to truth, but to stability. Stability required women like her to disappear quietly so the image could remain intact. One night, a novice named Clara slipped into Agnes's cell. She was trembling, eyes wide. She whispered that she had read the journal before it was taken, that she recognized herself in its pages, that she was afraid. Agnes listened, heart aching, knowing this moment was dangerous for them both. She told Clara to protect herself, to survive. Clara asked if that meant staying silent, forever. Agnes had no answer. The question haunted her long after Clara left, lingering like a wound that refused to close. Agnes began to consider leaving the convent, a thought that once felt like failure. Now it felt like clarity. Staying meant validating the system. Leaving meant being labeled unfaithful, unstable, disobedient. The town would not see courage in her departure. They would see proof that authority had been right. The cost of truth would be her reputation, her community, her identity. She prayed not for escape, but for discernment, for the strength to choose a path that did not betray her conscience. The diocese sent notice that Agnes would be transferred at the end of summer. No explanation, no discussion. A quiet solution. Move the problem. Preserve the image. Hollow Creek would remain untouched. Agnes realized the system did not need her silence anymore. It needed her absence. And that absence would be framed as mercy, as opportunity, as God's will. On her last walk through the gardens, Agnes felt grief, but not regret. She had tried to change the convent. The city had turned its back on her. Yet something remained unresolved, a tension that transfer alone could not erase. The truth she carried would not disappear with her. It would follow her, demanding form, demanding voice. As the bells rang that evening, Agnes understood that her story was no longer confined to stone walls or a small town unwilling to listen. What came next would test her faith, more than obedience ever had. And for the first time since arriving in Hollow Creek, she felt afraid not of punishment, but of what might happen if she finally refused to be invisible. Agnes left Hollow Creek at dawn, carrying a single suitcase and the weight of a story no one there wanted told. The transfer letter described her departure as routine, a reassignment meant for spiritual growth. No farewell was organized, no blessing offered beyond formal words. The convent gates closed behind her, with the same quiet certainty they had always used, sealing off not just a place, but an entire version of her life. As the bus pulled away, Agnes watched the hills shrink in the distance, knowing the town would continue unchanged, relieved to have restored its preferred silence. Her new assignment was in a convent outside the city, attached to a parish hospital in a neighboring county. The contrast was immediate. The pace was faster, the rules less rigid, the supervision less constant. Yet Agnes did not relax. Experience had taught her that systems rarely announce their limits. They revealed them slowly. She moved carefully, observing, listening, speaking only when necessary. Some sisters were kind, some curious. None asked about Hollow Creek. The absence of questions was itself an answer. Transfers erased context. Whatever happened before was meant to stay buried. Agnes requested work in patient care and was assigned to administrative support instead. The decision was framed as balance, a chance to recover from strain. She recognized the pattern instantly. Distance first, containment second. Still, this place lacked the tight grip of Hollow Creek. The town surrounding the hospital was larger, less unified, less invested in preserving a single image. That difference mattered. Here, the church shared space with other institutions. Authority competed. Silence was harder to enforce. At night, Agnes replayed memories she had tried to suppress. The journal, confiscated and likely destroyed. Clara's fear, Margaret's collapse. The festival banners praising unity, the polite cruelty of being erased. She realized the pain had followed her, sharper now without constant routine to dull it. Prayer became raw, less structured. She spoke to God not as an obedient servant, but as someone demanding to be seen. Faith no longer felt gentle. It felt confrontational, urgent, alive. Weeks passed. Agnes began volunteering unofficially in the hospital ward during understaffed shifts. Nurses welcomed the help. Patients responded to her presence. She listened, advocated, spoke gently but firmly when concerns were dismissed. Old instincts returned. Compassion did not require permission, yet she sensed she was being watched again, not with hostility but curiosity. Authority rarely ignores deviation. It studies it, measures it, waits. One afternoon, a social worker named Elena approached Agnes after a shift. She thanked her for intervening on behalf of an elderly patient, whose pain had been minimized. Their conversation was brief, but charged with recognition. Elena asked how long Agnes had worked in religious life. Agnes hesitated, then answered honestly. Elena nodded, as if something clicked into place. She did not pry. She simply said, "You don't sound like someone who learned silence easily." The comment lingered long after they parted. Agnes began to understand that Hollow Creek had taught her more than obedience. It had taught her how systems protect themselves, how cruelty hides behind structure, how language sanctifies harm. Those lessons did not disappear with geography. They sharpened her perception. She started noticing patterns everywhere. Who spoke in meetings, who cleaned afterward, whose labor was praised publicly, and whose was expected quietly. The church was not unique, it was familiar. The idea of speaking out returned slowly, unwelcome and persistent. Agnes resisted it at first. She knew the cost. The label of troublemaker followed women across institutions. She had lived it. But silence now felt like betrayal, not of God, but of the women still trapped in places like Hollow Creek. She wondered how many Agneses existed, transferred, erased, carrying truths that never surfaced because survival demanded compliance. Elena introduced her to a small advocacy group that supported patients and caregivers harmed by institutional neglect. Agnes attended one meeting anonymously. She listened as stories unfolded, painfully, similar to her own. Different settings, same machinery, control framed as care, discipline framed as love, authority insulated from consequence. Agnes felt something shift. Her story was not isolated. It was part of a pattern large enough to name. That night, Agnes dreamed of the convent bells. They rang endlessly, louder than before, impossible to ignore. She woke with resolve she did not fully understand yet. The system had counted on her exhaustion. It had assumed transfer would dissolve. Resistance. It had mistaken removal for resolution. Agnes realized then that her struggle was no longer about changing one convent or one town. It was about refusing erasure altogether. She began writing again, this time openly, carefully, without names, but with clarity. She documented structures, practices, outcomes. She connected dots. The words came easier now. Fear remained, but it no longer ruled her. She shared drafts with Elena, who read them slowly, seriously. No reassurance, no dismissal. Only recognition. That was enough. Agnes knew that speaking would provoke response. Institutions do not forgive exposure. They retaliate quietly, efficiently. She would lose protection, community, certainty. But she had already lost those once in Hollow Creek. There was nothing sacred about repeating the silence. The city had turned its back on her. The convent had erased her. What remained was choice. As summer ended, Agnes stood at the edge of something irreversible. She had tried to change the system from within and been removed. Now she understood that change rarely begins where permission is required. It begins where truth is spoken without guarantee of welcome. Agnes prayed not for safety, but for courage. The bells rang somewhere far away, but this time she did not bow her head. Agnes did not announce her decision. She understood that declarations invited containment, and containment was what the system did best. Instead, she moved quietly, deliberately, letting intention mature before action. She continued her duties at the hospital, spoke gently, worked diligently, and kept writing in the evenings. Her words became sharper, more focused. She stripped emotion where it weakened credibility and preserved detail where truth demanded precision. What she was building was not accusation. It was testimony. Elena helped her understand how stories gained power when they stopped sounding like grievances and started sounding like patterns. Together, they mapped similarities between cases, identified language institutions used to deflect responsibility, and documented how women were repositioned when they became inconvenient. Agnes felt the familiar tension return, not fear, but recognition. This was the same machinery she had seen in Hollow Creek, only now it was visible, articulated, named. The first time Agnes shared a short reflection publicly, she did so anonymously. It appeared on a small online forum dedicated to institutional ethics. She avoided names, locations, titles. She spoke only of experience. The response surprised her. Women replied with fragments of recognition. Some thanked her, some warned her to stop, some asked if she was safe. Agnes realized that silence had protected institutions, not people. Speech, even cautious speech, shifted the balance slightly. Within weeks, the tone around her changed. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Meetings were rescheduled without notice. A supervisor asked whether she felt overwhelmed. The language was familiar. Concern disguised as containment. Agnes smiled politely and answered carefully. She had learned that truth did not need to be loud to be dangerous. It only needed to exist where it was not supposed to. A letter arrived from the diocese requesting a meeting. No explanation was offered. The phrasing was cordial, pastoral, urgent. Agnes felt the old tightening in her chest, but it did not paralyze her this time. She knew what this was. Authority sensed deviation and moved to address it privately before it spread. The meeting took place in a neutral office, away from the hospital, away from witnesses. Two men sat across from her. They spoke of unity, of vocation, of the dangers of scandal. They asked if she had been writing publicly. Agnes did not deny it. She did not volunteer details either. She said only that she believed truth served faith, not threatened it. One of them smiled sadly and suggested that her perspective might be shaped by unresolved resentment from her previous assignment. Agnes recognized the strategy immediately. Discredit the voice, not the content. They warned her gently that public discourse could harm her future within the church. Transfers could become more frequent. Opportunities could narrow. She listened without interrupting. When they finished, she said something she had rehearsed carefully. She said that her conscience required her to speak honestly about harm, that she did not seek conflict, but she would not choose silence to preserve comfort. The room went still. Authority did not expect refusal delivered without hostility. After the meeting, Agnes was placed on temporary leave pending review. The language framed it as care. She was encouraged to rest, reflect, pray. Elena helped her secure temporary housing. The hospital distanced itself quietly. Friends hesitated. Familiar ground receded quickly. Agnes felt the cost of resistance immediately. The system did not need to argue. It simply withdrew access. Despite this, messages continued to arrive. Women shared stories privately, some from religious life, some from hospitals, schools, shelters. Different settings, same structure. Agnes responded cautiously, directing them to advocacy groups, encouraging documentation, protecting identities. She understood now that exposure without preparation destroyed individuals while leaving systems intact. Change required patience, networks, resilience. The small post grew into a longer piece, then another. Eventually, a journalist reached out, asking to speak off the record. Agnes hesitated. She knew the consequences of visibility, but she also knew that anonymity could only carry truth so far. Institutions thrived on plausible deniability. Names forced response. Faces demanded reckoning. She prayed long into the night, not for certainty, but for integrity. When she agreed to speak, she did so with conditions. No sensationalism, no focus on her alone. The story had to center the pattern. The journalist listened, took notes, asked careful questions. Agnes spoke of Hollow Creek without naming it, described mechanisms rather than villains. She insisted that faith and harm were not opposites, that harm often wore the language of holiness. The article was published quietly, without fanfare. It spread anyway. Comments polarized instantly. Some praised courage, others accused betrayal. Church officials released statements affirming commitment to care and unity. No acknowledgement of specifics. Agnes was officially removed from public ministry pending further discernment. The language was familiar, merciful, final. Agnes felt grief, but also relief. The threat of erasure no longer loomed. It had already happened. What remained was voice. She had lost protection, status, belonging. But she had gained clarity. The city had turned its back on her. The convent had discarded her. Still, the truth had escaped containment. As she read messages from women who felt seen for the first time, Agnes understood that systems measured success by silence. Breaking that silence did not guarantee reform. It guaranteed consequence. But consequence was no longer something she feared. It was proof that her words had reached where obedience never could. She closed her laptop and sat quietly, aware that this was only the beginning. Institutions did not collapse from exposure. They adapted. They resisted. They waited. Agnes would have to endure that resistance. But she no longer mistook endurance for submission. Faith, she realized, was not obedience to power. It was fidelity to truth, even when the city refused to look back. Agnes learned quickly that exposure did not end a story. It fractured it. Once the article circulated, life became a sequence of aftershocks rather than a single event. Some days were quiet, almost deceptively normal. Others arrived heavy with consequences she could not predict. Emails stopped coming from certain addresses, invitations disappeared. Her name became something people weighed before speaking. She was no longer ignored. She was managed, categorized, quietly isolated again, this time beyond convent walls. The diocese released another statement weeks later, reaffirming its values and announcing an internal review. No timeline, no scope, no mention of women. Agnes recognized the maneuver. Reviews functioned as pauses, not solutions. They slowed momentum, absorbed outrage, and reassured the public that authority remained intact. The town where she now lived absorbed the news cautiously. Some parishioners treated her with reverence, others with suspicion. Many avoided her altogether, uncertain whether proximity carried risk. Financial reality followed swiftly. With her public ministry suspended, stipends ended. Housing arrangements became temporary. Elena helped where she could, but Agnes felt the vulnerability settle in her bones. The system did not need to imprison dissenters. It simply withdrew. resources and waited for exhaustion to do its work. Agnes found part-time work with the advocacy group, administrative tasks, documentation, training volunteers. It paid little, but it kept her connected to purpose. Women continued to reach out, some cautiously, some desperately. Agnes listened more than she spoke. She learned that telling the truth publicly often left private wounds untreated. Many women were not ready to be seen. They feared retaliation, disbelief, spiritual condemnation. Agnes never pushed. She knew too well how fragile survival could be. Instead, she helped them find language for themselves, even if it remained unspoken outside safe rooms and closed doors. Not all responses were supportive. Anonymous messages accused her of seeking attention, of misunderstanding doctrine, of fabricating harm. One letter quoted scripture, reminding her that obedience was greater than sacrifice. Another warned that she was endangering souls. Agnes read them slowly, carefully, feeling their weight without letting them rewrite her memory. The cruelty was not loud. It was precise, designed to make her doubt her own clarity. The journalist contacted her again, sharing that editors were hesitant to pursue further pieces without institutional confirmation. Agnes was not surprised. Stories that implicated systems required permission from the very systems they examined. She thanked him and declined to push. Truth did not always move forward. Sometimes it waited, accumulating. Strength quietly, like pressure beneath stone. Elena invited Agnes to speak at a closed meeting of caregivers and advocates. No press, no recording. Agnes hesitated, then agreed. The room was small, filled with women who listened intently. She spoke without notes, not about Hollow Creek specifically, but about how power functioned when shielded by moral language. She watched recognition ripple through the room. Heads nodded. Eyes filled. Silence followed, not heavy, but shared. After the meeting, a woman approached her, older, composed. She introduced herself as a former administrator from another diocese. She said she had seen the same patterns years ago and left quietly to protect herself. She told Agnes that speaking had cost her everything at the time. Then she added something Agnes had not expected. She said that hearing Agnes speak made her regret staying silent longer than she had. The admission stayed with Agnes, unsettling and affirming at once. The church responded, indirectly. A new pastoral letter emphasized listening, dialogue, and unity. Workshops were announced, committees formed. Agnes read the language with practiced eyes. It was careful, ambiguous, non-committal. Change was framed as internal reflection rather than accountability. No mention of consequences for those harmed. No acknowledgement of power imbalance. The system adapted as she had known it would. There were moments when exhaustion pressed hard. Agnes missed the structure of convent life, the rhythm of prayer shared, the certainty of belonging. She missed believing that obedience would be met with care. Now, every choice required negotiation. Every step forward carried risk. She wondered sometimes whether she had traded one form of constraint for another. Freedom was not simple. It demanded constant courage. Yet something fundamental had shifted. She no longer waited for permission to be whole. Her faith, stripped of institutional shelter, had become personal, resilient. She prayed alone, not out of exile, but in tension. She found God not in authority, but in honesty, in the quiet resolve of women refusing to disappear. That realization sustained her when doubt crept close. The advocacy group began compiling a report, anonymized, documenting recurring patterns across institutions. Agnes contributed carefully, aware of legal implications. The goal was not exposure alone, but reform grounded in evidence. Whether anyone in power would read it remained uncertain. But the act of compiling truth felt necessary, almost sacramental. Bearing witness was no longer theoretical. It was labor. One afternoon, Agnes received a message from Clara, the novice from Hollow Creek. The message was brief, cautious, written from a new address. Clara said she had been transferred. She said she remembered the journal. She said she was still afraid. Agnes wrote back slowly, choosing words that would not endanger her. She told Clara she was not alone, that survival was not failure. That silence chosen freely was different from silence imposed. Agnes closed her laptop and sat quietly, feeling the weight of continuity. Hollow Creek was still there. The convent still stood. The city still believed what it needed to believe. Change had not arrived dramatically. No bells rang, no apologies were issued, but something irreversible had occurred nonetheless. The story had escaped its borders. Agnes understood now that systems did not fall when challenged. They endured. They waited. They counted on fatigue. Resistance was not a moment. It was a life. She did not know where this path would lead or what it would cost next. But she knew she would not return to invisibility. The city had turned its back on her. The convent had erased her name. Still, her voice remained steady, present, and unwilling to retreat. And in a world built on quiet obedience, that persistence alone was a form of change the system could not fully contain. Agnes began to notice how time changed once she stopped waiting for reinstatement. Days no longer revolved around decisions made elsewhere. There was no letter she expected, no approval she anticipated. That absence created space, uncomfortable at first, then slowly clarifying. She organized her life around what was tangible: work with the advocacy group, long conversations with women who needed to be heard, quiet evenings where prayer was no longer scripted, but honest. The system had taught her structure. Leaving it taught her agency. The report the group was compiling grew steadily. Patterns repeated themselves with unnerving consistency. Women reassigned after speaking up. Concerns reframed as emotional instability. Compassion treated as boundary violation. Authority protected through ambiguity. Agnes helped categorize language, tracing how harm was softened until it sounded like care. She realized that power rarely defended itself with cruelty. It defended itself with procedure. Procedure was harder to argue with, harder to expose, easier to accept. As the work progressed, subtle pressure returned. Funding opportunities evaporated. Partner organizations hesitated. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. No one said why. Agnes understood without explanation. Institutions communicated efficiently through silence. Still, the group persisted, adjusting, downsizing, continuing. They had learned that waiting for conditions to improve meant waiting forever. One evening, Agnes was invited to speak at a small university class on ethics and care work. The invitation surprised her. She had not sought academic spaces, yet when she arrived, she recognized the same attentiveness she had seen in advocacy rooms. Students listened closely, asking careful questions. One asked how she distinguished faith from the institution that had rejected her. Agnes paused before answering. She said faith was what remained when authority failed. It was not loyalty to structure, but commitment to truth and compassion, even when that commitment demanded loss. After the lecture, a professor thanked her quietly and warned her that visibility always carried consequence. Agnes smiled. She knew. Consequence was no longer abstract. It was familiar, manageable, survivable. Fear had lost its power to paralyze her because it had already delivered its worst. Everything beyond that was endurance. The church released the findings of its internal review months later. The language was polished, reassuring. No systemic issues identified. Recommendations focused on communication, spiritual formation, mutual understanding. Agnes read the summary carefully. It was exactly what she had expected. Closure without accountability, reflection without reform. The city would accept it gladly. It always did. The response from women was different. Messages arrived expressing disappointment but not surprise. Many thanked Agnes for naming what the review avoided. Some shared that the report confirmed their belief that speaking internally changed nothing. Agnes felt the familiar mixture of anger and resolve. Institutions declared themselves resolved long before those harmed were allowed to heal. Fatigue set in quietly. Agnes found herself withdrawing more often, turning down invitations, delaying responses. Elena noticed and insisted on rest. Burnout, she said, was another tool systems relied on. They did not need to silence voices if they could exhaust them. Agnes listened. She took time away, walked, read, prayed. She learned that resistance without care simply reproduced the same harm it opposed. During that pause, Agnes reflected on Hollow Creek more than she had in months. She wondered if anything there had changed, if Clara was safe, if the infirmary still operated without oversight. She knew the answers were likely unchanged. Yet she also knew that something subtle had shifted. Awareness, once sparked, did not disappear entirely. It lingered, even in denial. A letter arrived from the former administrator she had met earlier. The woman wrote that she had begun speaking privately with others, cautiously, sharing what she had once buried. She said Agnes's persistence had given her permission she did not know she needed. The letter moved Agnes deeply. Change, she realized, rarely announced itself. It unfolded quietly, through conversations no one documented. The advocacy group finalized the report and released it publicly with legal review. Coverage was limited, but real. A few outlets picked it up. Social media reacted predictably, polarized and fleeting. The church responded with another statement. Agnes no longer read them closely. She knew the language too well. What mattered were the private messages, the slow shift in how women spoke to one another, less apologetically, more clearly. Agnes was invited to join the group's leadership formally. She hesitated. Leadership brought visibility, responsibility, scrutiny. It also offered stability and direction. She accepted, aware that she was choosing a path that would not circle back to institutional comfort. Her life would be smaller in some ways, larger in others. She felt no regret. One night, Agnes dreamed of Hollow Creek again. This time, she stood outside the convent gates, not trying to enter, not trying to change anything. She simply stood, visible, unafraid. The bells rang as they always had, but they no longer commanded her attention. She woke with a calm she had not felt in years. The city that had turned its back on her still existed. The convent still stood. The system still endured. But Agnes no longer measured her worth against its recognition. She had learned that institutions survived by convincing people they were necessary for meaning. Losing them felt like death until one discovered meaning elsewhere. Agnes's story did not end in vindication. There was no apology, no reinstatement, no acknowledgement from those who had erased her. What remained was quieter and more durable. Network of voices, a body of truth, a refusal to disappear. She had tried to change the convent and been removed. She had spoken, and the city had turned away. Yet she remained, living proof that silence was not the only faithful response. And in a world that depended on women absorbing harm quietly, her continued presence, steady and uncompromising, was a disruption that could not be undone. Agnes understood now that resistance was not about winning. It was about witnessing, about standing where systems expected emptiness, about refusing to let erasure be the final word. And as she prepared for what came next, she knew one thing with certainty. Even if the city never turned back, she would not. Agnes had learned to live with the absence of resolution. But absence did not mean stillness. The work continued to expand in ways she could not have predicted. Invitations arrived from small groups, community centers, informal networks of women who recognized fragments of their own experiences in her words. None of these spaces promised safety or permanence. What they offered was honesty. Agnes accepted selectively, careful not to become a symbol rather than a person. Symbols were easier to dismiss. People were harder. At one gathering, a woman asked whether Agnes still considered herself a nun. The question was not hostile, only curious. Agnes paused, aware of how loaded the answer could be. She said that vows did not disappear simply because institutions withdrew recognition. But identity, she added, was not owned by hierarchy. Faith was not a title. It was a practice. Some nodded. Others looked uncertain. Agnes had learned that uncertainty was often the first crack in unquestioned belief. The advocacy group faced its own internal tensions. Growth brought disagreement, fear, competing visions. Some wanted more visibility, others less. Some pushed for confrontation, others for collaboration. Agnes listened carefully. She had seen how movements fractured, when urgency replaced care. She reminded them that systems survived division easily. What they feared most was sustained coherence. The group moved forward cautiously, unevenly, but together. A university researcher reached out requesting access to anonymized data from the report. Agnes hesitated, then agreed under strict conditions. Research offered legitimacy institutions respected. It also carried risk. Data could be neutralized, reframed, stripped of moral weight. Still, Agnes believed. Evidence mattered. Truth needed multiple forms to survive. Story alone was dismissed as emotion. Data alone was dismissed as abstraction. Together, they endured longer. Meanwhile, the church adjusted its posture again. New guidelines were released, emphasizing transparency and accompaniment. Some parishes adopted them enthusiastically. Others ignored them entirely. Agnes observed this without surprise. Systems rarely moved as wholes. They shifted in fragments depending on who felt threatened and who felt safe. Progress, when it appeared, was uneven and fragile. Agnes received another message from Clara, longer this time. Clara wrote that she had begun noticing the same patterns Agnes once named. She wrote that awareness made daily life harder, not easier. Obedience no longer felt innocent. Silence no longer felt neutral. Agnes responded with care. She told Clara that seeing clearly often came before knowing what to do. That survival sometimes required patience, not retreat. That courage did not always look like action. Sometimes it looked like staying alive. These exchanges reminded Agnes that impact was rarely immediate or visible. She might never see Hollow Creek change. She might never know how many women found language because of her. The system counted on that uncertainty to discourage resistance. Agnes learned to live without measurement. Faith, she realized, had never promised results. It had promised presence. There were days when loneliness pressed heavily. Former sisters remained distant. Family members worried quietly. Old friends spoke less often. Agnes grieved those losses without romanticizing them. Choosing integrity over belonging carried cost. Acknowledging that cost did not weaken her resolve. It clarified it. She had not been mistaken about the system. She had simply underestimated how deeply people relied on it to feel safe. One afternoon, Agnes attended a town hall meeting unrelated to her work. She sat quietly in the back, listening to local debates about budgets and roads. As she watched how decisions were framed, she recognized familiar dynamics. Authority deferred upward, responsibility diffused outward. Those with least power bore the greatest consequences. The patterns repeated everywhere. Hollow Creek had not been an anomaly, It had been a training ground. After the meeting, a woman approached Agnes hesitantly. She said she had read the article months ago and recognized herself in it. She said she had never spoken about her experience before. They talked briefly, exchanging contact information. The moment was small, almost forgettable. Agnes knew better. Change rarely arrived loudly. It arrived person by person, quietly disrupting the expectation of silence. The advocacy group began planning long-term support structures rather than reactive responses, training programs, legal referrals, safe documentation practices. Agnes contributed where she could, careful not to replicate the same hierarchies she opposed. Power, she had learned, did not disappear when intentions were good. It needed constant examination. She insisted on shared decision-making, transparency, rest. At night, Agnes sometimes revisited the early days in Hollow Creek, remembering the certainty she once carried. She did not miss it. Certainty had made obedience easier, but it had dulled compassion. Now, faith felt less stable, more demanding, but truer. God no longer sounded like authority. God sounded like insistence, like a question that refused to be silenced. The city that had turned its back on her continued without pause. The convent likely still stood, its bells ringing on schedule. Agnes no longer imagined herself returning there, vindicated or forgiven. Forgiveness was not the point. The point was refusal. Refusal to participate in erasure. Refusal to confuse peace with silence. Agnes understood that the story unfolding was larger than her. It was about how institutions trained people to doubt their own perception, about how women were praised for endurance and punished for clarity, about how faith was used to sanctify imbalance. Her role was not to resolve this. It was to remain present within it. As she prepared for another meeting, another conversation, another careful step forward, Agnes felt neither triumph nor despair. She felt grounded. The work was slow, the resistance persistent, the cost ongoing. But she had learned that integrity did not require applause. It required consistency. She had tried to change the convent and failed. The city had turned its back on her. Still she remained, bearing witness in small rooms, quiet conversations, careful words. And in a world accustomed to women disappearing, her continued presence was not loud, but it was undeniable. Agnes began to feel the long weight of time settle into her work, a heaviness different from urgency. The early intensity had faded, replaced by something steadier and more demanding. There were no breakthroughs now, no sudden shifts in public opinion, no dramatic confrontations. What remained was continuity, showing up, answering messages, reading drafts, sitting with stories that did not resolve neatly, the kind of labor that rarely made headlines but slowly reshaped the people involved. She noticed how often women apologized before speaking, apologized for taking time, for being emotional, for remembering details incorrectly. Agnes gently interrupted those habits when she could, not with correction, but with permission. She reminded them that clarity did not require politeness, and pain did not need justification. Watching women straighten slightly as they spoke was one of the few moments that felt like progress she could touch. The advocacy group faced renewed scrutiny when a regional paper published an opinion piece questioning its credibility. The article did not refute data. It questioned motives. It suggested bitterness, ideology, exaggeration. Agnes recognized the pattern immediately. When facts could not be dismantled, character became the target. The group debated whether to respond. Agnes advised restraint. Systems thrived on reaction. Silence, chosen deliberately, could also be strategy. They released a brief statement reaffirming their commitment and returned to work. Privately, the piece unsettled her more than she expected, not because it was persuasive, but because it echoed voices from Hollow Creek. The same language, repackaged, She spent an evening restless, pacing, praying without words. The old fear flickered, not of punishment, but of being misunderstood forever. She reminded herself that misunderstanding had never stopped harm. It had only protected those who benefited from it. A request arrived from a legal clinic seeking input on a proposed framework for reporting institutional neglect. Agnes reviewed the draft carefully. It was procedural, cautious, designed to fit within existing structures. She offered suggestions, noting where language minimized power imbalance and where safeguards were insufficient. The lawyers listened, adjusted, pushed back in places. The exchange was slow, imperfect, but real. Agnes understood that law moved at the pace of institutions, not people. Still, even incremental shifts mattered. During this period, Agnes encountered a former priest who had left ministry years earlier. He recognized her name and asked to speak. Their conversation was tentative, layered with history, neither fully trusted. He admitted that he had seen similar dynamics but had remained silent to protect his position. He said he did not know if he would do things differently now. Agnes appreciated the honesty. She did not absolve him. She did not condemn him. She understood how fear worked. Understanding, however, did not erase responsibility. The exchange left her thoughtful. She realized that many people within systems were not villains, but beneficiaries of imbalance. Their comfort depended on not looking too closely. Change required them to feel unsettled, and few welcomed that. Agnes no longer expected allies where power was concentrated. She looked instead for those willing to relinquish comfort, even partially. They were rarer, but they existed. The city where she now lived began to feel familiar. Not safe exactly, but navigable. People knew her work. Some respected it quietly. Others avoided her. Agnes accepted both responses without resentment. She had learned that neutrality often masked discomfort. She no longer tried to convert it. Presence was enough. She received an invitation to return to Hollow Creek for a public event unrelated to the convent. The message was polite, almost casual. Agnes sat with it for a long time. Returning would provoke speculation. Staying away would preserve distance. She declined gently. She was not ready to stand in a place that had refused to stand with her. Distance, too, could be a boundary. That decision stirred unexpected grief. Hollow Creek had been a home, once, however flawed. Leaving it unresolved left a quiet ache. Agnes allowed herself to feel it without interpreting it as regret. Loss did not mean error. Some things could not be repaired because the cost of repair was truth, and truth had been refused. Clara wrote again, saying she was considering leaving religious life. She was afraid of what came next, of disappointing people, of losing meaning. Agnes responded slowly, carefully. She told Clara that leaving did not mean failure, and staying did not mean success. Meaning was not guaranteed by either choice. What mattered was whether Clara could live honestly within the path she chose. Agnes did not advise. She accompanied. As months passed, Agnes noticed something subtle but significant. Women began referencing each other rather than authority, sharing names of advocates, lawyers, counselors, building informal networks that did not depend on permission. This was not reform, it was adaptation. Survival evolving into resistance. The system could not monitor what it did not officially recognize. These quiet connections felt more dangerous to power than any public statement. Agnes understood now that the city had turned its back on her because looking at her meant looking at itself. The convent had erased her because acknowledging her meant questioning its legitimacy. Systems did not fear critics, they feared mirrors. Agnes had become one, and mirrors were uncomfortable to live with. She adjusted her expectations accordingly. She no longer imagined a future where the church apologized publicly or dismantled its hierarchies. She imagined instead a future where fewer women internalized silence as holiness, where harm was named sooner, where obedience was questioned before it calcified into doctrine. These were modest hopes. They felt achievable. One evening, Agnes sat alone after a long day, the city quiet outside her window. She reflected on how far she had moved from the young woman who arrived in Hollow Creek. Believing change came through patience alone. Patience had its place, but without truth it became endurance for someone else's benefit. She had learned the difference painfully. Her life now lacked the certainty she once prized. There was no clear path, no institution promising protection, no ritual guaranteeing belonging. What she had instead was alignment between what she believed, what she said, and how she lived. That alignment was fragile, easily disrupted, but real. It sustained her when affirmation did not. Agnes did not know how her story would end. She suspected there would be no resolution neat enough to satisfy anyone watching from the outside. What mattered was that the story continued without surrendering its core. She had tried to change the convent and been removed. The city had turned its back on her. Still she remained, choosing presence over approval, truth over comfort. And in that choice, repeated daily without applause, Agnes found a form of faith deeper than obedience had ever allowed. Agnes became increasingly aware that the most difficult part of her work was not opposition, but normalization. Over time, resistance blended into routine. The extraordinary became ordinary. Stories that once shocked began to sound familiar, even predictable. Agnes guarded against that dulling carefully. Familiarity, she knew, was how injustice survived long enough to be accepted. She forced herself to remain attentive, to treat each account as singular, even when the patterns were unmistakable. The advocacy group entered a quieter phase. Funding stabilized modestly. Processes solidified. Training materials were revised and circulated. Nothing about it felt dramatic. This, Agnes learned, was how movements matured. Not through moments of visibility, but through structures that could withstand fatigue. She took on more responsibility, coordinating support across regions, mentoring younger advocates. Leadership, she discovered, required restraint more than conviction. The temptation to rush outcomes had to be resisted daily. A university invited her to collaborate on a long-term study examining moral authority and institutional silence. Agnes hesitated again. Academia carried its own hierarchies, its own incentives to soften language for acceptance, but she agreed under conditions that survivors' voices would remain central. The project moved slowly, constrained by ethics boards and careful phrasing. Agnes accepted the pace. Slowness, when chosen, deliberately could be protective rather than suppressive. Her relationship with faith continued to evolve. She no longer attended formal services regularly. When she did, she listened differently. Sermons about obedience unsettled her. She noticed which scriptures were emphasized and which were avoided. She began meeting privately with a small group for shared reflection, outside institutional oversight. The conversations were unpolished, often unresolved, but honest. Faith returned to her, not as instruction, but as struggle. The church released another initiative focused on listening sessions. Agnes was invited to attend one as an observer. She considered it carefully, then declined. She understood the mechanics now. Listening without power redistribution was performance. She no longer lent her presence to rituals designed to absorb critique without changing behavior. That refusal felt like progress, even if it went unnoticed. Not everyone understood her stance. Some women asked why. She did not work within the system anymore. Agnes answered honestly. She said she had tried, and the cost had been silence. Working outside was not ideal. It was simply the only place where speech was not immediately neutralized. She did not romanticize the choice. It was lonelier, less secure, more exposed. But it was honest. She received word that Hollow Creek had appointed a new abbess. The announcement was brief, circulated quietly. Agnes felt a momentary tightening, then release. Change of leadership did not guarantee change of structure. She resisted the urge to imagine reconciliation. Closure was a narrative imposed from the outside. She no longer needed it to continue. Clara wrote again, saying she had left religious life. The message was short, cautious, heavy with uncertainty. Agnes responded gently, affirming Clara's courage without framing it as triumph. Leaving was not liberation, it was transition. Agnes knew too well how disorienting it could be. She offered support, without expectation, presence without agenda. The legal framework Agnes had contributed to was piloted in 2 institutions. Early feedback was mixed. Some administrators welcomed clarity, others resisted. Agnes took note. Resistance was data. Where systems pushed back hardest, often revealed where power felt most threatened. She shared observations with the team, careful not to assign blame prematurely. Strategy required patience. There were moments when Agnes felt the pull of invisibility again, the desire to step back, to let others carry the weight, to rest indefinitely. She honored those impulses without surrendering to them. Burnout, she had learned, was not failure. It was information. She adjusted her pace, delegated more, rested when possible. Survival remained an act of resistance. She thought often about the phrase that had followed her since Hollow Creek, knowing one's place. Agnes understood now that the phrase was never about humility. It was about containment. Knowing one's place meant staying where one could be managed. Leaving that place disrupted expectations. It demanded new responses. Institutions struggled with that. The city where she lived continued to accept her work quietly. She was no longer controversial. She was categorized. Categorization, she realized, was another form of containment. As long as she remained predictable, she was tolerable. Agnes accepted this without illusion. Predictability did not mean harmlessness. It meant she had learned how to persist without constant confrontation. One afternoon, she was asked whether she believed change was possible. The question came from a student, earnest, hopeful. Agnes paused. She said change was not inevitable. It was conditional. It depended on whether people were willing to endure discomfort longer than systems could endure exposure. The student nodded slowly, as if absorbing something heavier than expected. As the year turned, Agnes reviewed her own transformation with a clarity that surprised her. She had not become harder, as she once feared. She had become more precise, less willing to accept abstraction, less impressed by declarations, more attentive to lived reality. Faith, once filtered through obedience, now passed through conscience. She did not imagine herself returning to institutional life. That door had closed decisively. She also did not imagine herself retreating into bitterness. Anger, when unexamined, became another form of captivity. Agnes worked daily to keep her anger aligned with purpose, not ego. That discipline mattered more than any vow she had once taken. The story of Hollow Creek no longer dominated her thoughts. It had receded into context rather than center. What remained central were the women she met each week, the structures they navigated, the language they reclaimed. Change did not announce itself with resolution. It unfolded quietly, unevenly, through presence. Agnes had tried to change the convent and been removed. The city had turned its back on her. Still she remained, not waiting for validation, not seeking reversal. Her life no longer revolved around what had been denied her. It revolved around what she refused to deny others: voice, dignity, and the right to see clearly. And in that steady refusal, repeated day after day without guarantee. Agnes found a form of faith no institution could confer or revoke. Agnes noticed that as her work continued, the questions people asked her began to change. At first, they had asked what happened, then why it happened, and later how it could be prevented. Now, increasingly, they asked how to live with the knowledge once it was acquired, how to remain inside institutions that no longer felt innocent, how to pray, work, teach, or serve without feeling complicit. These questions carried a different weight. They did not seek solutions. They sought permission to feel conflicted without collapsing. She answered carefully, aware that advice could become another form of authority. She told them there was no clean way to live inside broken systems, only conscious ways. That awareness would always bring discomfort, and that discomfort was not a sign of failure, but of integrity. The goal, she said, was not purity, but honesty. Many nodded, relieved, as if absolved from an impossible standard they had never chosen but always felt bound to meet. The advocacy group expanded its scope quietly, partnering with counselors and trauma specialists. Agnes welcomed this shift. She had learned that naming harm without tending to its aftermath left people exposed. Storytelling was powerful, but it was not sufficient. Healing required containment, continuity, care. The group resisted pressure to scale too quickly. Growth without infrastructure reproduced the same neglect they sought to address. Agnes herself began therapy at Elena's urging. At first, she resisted, framing endurance as strength. The therapist gently challenged that instinct. Agnes learned to recognize how often she had absorbed responsibility for outcomes she could not control. How deeply obedience had trained her to equate worth with endurance. Naming these patterns felt unsettling, but freeing. Faith, she realized, had once been used to spiritualize self-erasure. Reclaiming it required unlearning that equation. The church's presence remained in the background of her life, no longer central, but not absent. Occasionally, she was asked to comment on new initiatives or controversies. She declined most requests, not out of fear, but discernment. Reactivity kept institutions relevant on their own terms. She chose instead to invest energy where she could influence process, not narrative. She was invited to contribute to a book project examining women's experiences across hierarchical organizations. Agnes agreed, writing a chapter that avoided spectacle. She focused on language, on how obedience was framed as virtue and resistance as immaturity. Writing felt different now. Less urgent, more deliberate. She no longer wrote to prove harm existed. She wrote to trace how it persisted. As publication approached, doubts surfaced again. Not about the truth of her words, but about their impact. Agnes had learned that exposure did not guarantee accountability. Still, she remembered the letters, the quiet conversations, the shifts she could not measure. Impact, she reminded herself, was not always visible to the one who initiated it. Clara visited her unexpectedly one afternoon. She looked older, though little time had passed. Leaving religious life had stripped her of certainty, but given her space to breathe. They spoke for hours, not only about Hollow Creek, but about ordinary things. Work, friendships, fear. Clara admitted she still missed the structure. Agnes understood. Structure offered safety when one felt lost. The challenge was learning to build structure that did not demand disappearance. As they parted, Clara said something that stayed with Agnes. She said that seeing Agnes continue, without reconciliation or reward, had changed her understanding of courage. Courage, she said, was not confrontation. It was consistency. Agnes felt the weight of that observation deeply. Consistency was quiet, uncelebrated, exhausting. It was also what systems struggled to extinguish. The city around Agnes shifted gradually. She was no longer introduced as controversial, but as experienced. The edge had dulled. She accepted that without pride. Being absorbed was another risk. Institutions often neutralized threats by professionalizing them. Agnes guarded against becoming predictable. She continued questioning process, redistributing authority, declining roles that concentrated power. She noticed how often women within organizations waited for permission to speak. Permission from leaders, from culture, from timing. Agnes encouraged them to notice that permission rarely arrived spontaneously. It was claimed, often tentatively, sometimes at cost. Waiting. Too long carried its own consequences. Silence, once internalized, became habit. The book was published with modest attention. Reviews were mixed. Some praised its nuance, others criticized it for lacking clear villains. Agnes welcomed the ambiguity. Villains simplified responsibility. Systems thrived on that simplification. Her work had never been about condemnation. It had been about clarity. There were evenings when exhaustion returned sharply, when the accumulation of stories pressed too heavily. Agnes learned to step back without disengaging. She tended her own life carefully now. Friendships outside the work, walks without purpose, prayer without agenda. These practices grounded her, reminding her that resistance did not require constant visibility. She thought less often now about what might have been. The young woman who arrived in Hollow Creek, believing obedience was synonymous with holiness, felt distant. Not wrong, but incomplete. That version of herself had not known the cost of silence nor the weight of speaking. Experience had not hardened her. It had refined her. Agnes no longer imagined an ending to her story that resembled vindication. There would be no moment where the city turned back, where the convent apologized, where authority admitted fault fully. She had released that expectation. What remained was continuity. The slow work of refusing erasure, of accompanying others as they named what they saw. She had tried to change the convent and been removed. The city had turned its back on her. Still she remained, living with complexity rather than fleeing it. Faith, she now understood, was not certainty preserved. It was courage sustained. And as she prepared for whatever season came next, Agnes knew that even without resolution, her life had coherence. She had aligned belief with action, voice with conscience. In a world structured to reward silence, that alignment was not small. It was enough to continue. Agnes began to recognize a subtle shift in herself that she had not anticipated. The anger that once flared sharply when she encountered denial or minimization had softened into something quieter and more enduring. It was not resignation. It was discernment. She no longer expected institutions to behave differently simply because harm had been named. Expectation, she learned, was a form of vulnerability the system exploited. What sustained her now was clarity without illusion. Her days settled into a rhythm that balanced engagement and distance. Mornings were often spent reviewing correspondence, connecting women with resources, advising quietly where possible. Afternoons belonged to meetings, research discussions, or training sessions. Evenings were protected. She cooked simple meals, read slowly, prayed without structure. Protecting that boundary felt as essential as any advocacy. Without it, the work consumed everything and left nothing alive behind it. The advocacy group faced a difficult decision when a major foundation expressed interest in funding their work with conditions. The foundation required measurable outcomes, public branding, and alignment with institutional partners. The proposal promised stability, reach, legitimacy. It also risked compromise. Agnes listened as the group debated. She spoke last. She said money was never neutral. It shaped language, priorities, pace. Accepting support that demanded dilution would reproduce the very dynamics they opposed. The group declined the offer. The decision cost them growth. It preserved coherence. That choice reverberated quietly. Some members worried they were being impractical. Others felt relief. Agnes knew the tension well. Survival and integrity often competed. She did not pretend there was a perfect answer, only trade-offs that had to be chosen consciously rather than absorbed unconsciously. Choosing slower work felt risky. It also felt honest. The university study reached an early milestone. Preliminary findings confirmed what Agnes had long observed. Institutions consistently framed women's dissent as emotional or personal rather than structural. Authority relied on language that appeared neutral while reinforcing hierarchy. Review boards prioritized reputation over repair. The data was clear. Agnes felt a muted satisfaction, not triumph. Evidence mattered, but it did not transform power by itself. It armed those already willing to listen. She was invited to present these findings at a closed conference. Agnes agreed, on the condition that survivors' voices not be anonymized into abstraction. The presentation was restrained, factual, unsettling. The room was polite, attentive, reserved. Questions followed about implementation, liability, feasibility. Few asked about harm. Agnes answered patiently, aware that even curiosity could be a step forward. Still, she left knowing that many in the room would return to their institutions unchanged. Later, a younger researcher approached her privately. She said she had recognized her own workplace in the patterns described. She asked what to do next. Agnes did not give instructions. She asked questions instead. What risks could she tolerate? Who depended on her income? What support she had? Resistance without strategy, Agnes had learned, became sacrifice without impact. The young woman nodded, thoughtful. Agnes understood that even asking these questions marked a beginning. The church continued its slow cycle of statements and initiatives. Agnes observed them, with professional detachment. She no longer felt personally addressed by them. That distance was protective. She knew that institutions often attempted reconciliation only when dissenters were sufficiently neutralized. Invitations arrived occasionally, framed as dialogue. Agnes declined politely. Dialogue without redistribution of power was performance. She would not lend her presence to it. Clara sent another message, describing her struggle to rebuild identity outside religious life. She felt unmoored, unsure how to pray without structure. Agnes responded with compassion. She told Clara that faith was not lost when form disappeared. It was revealed. Many people, Agnes wrote, only discovered what they truly believed when they were no longer told what belief should look like. The transition was painful. It was also generative. Agnes noticed that women who contacted her increasingly referenced one another. They spoke of conversations, shared resources, quiet alliances. The work was decentralizing itself. That pleased her. Movements that depended on a single voice were fragile. She encouraged this diffusion, even when it meant her own role diminished. Sustainability required letting go of centrality. There were moments when she wondered what her life might have looked like had she remained silent in Hollow Creek. She did not dwell on it. That path existed only in imagination. In reality, silence would have demanded parts of her she could not surrender without losing herself. The cost of speaking had been high. The cost of silence would have been higher. One evening, Agnes attended a small interfaith gathering focused on ethical leadership. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, she emphasized that leadership without accountability was merely authority wearing moral language. The room was quiet afterward, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Agnes recognized that momentary stillness. It often preceded either dismissal or change. She did not stay to find out which. Her therapist noted that Agnes had become more comfortable with uncertainty. Agnes agreed. Certainty, she had learned, was often borrowed from authority. Letting it go required trust in process rather than outcome. She no longer needed to believe that her work would succeed in conventional terms. She needed only to believe it was truthful. As the seasons shifted again, Agnes felt neither anticipation nor dread. She felt grounded. Her life no longer revolved around reaction. It revolved around alignment. That alignment demanded vigilance, humility, rest. It was not glamorous. It was sustainable. She thought again of Hollow Creek, not with bitterness, but with clarity. The city had turned its back on her because turning toward her would have required reckoning. The convent had erased her because acknowledging her would have disrupted order. These truths no longer wounded her. They informed her. Agnes understood now that resistance was rarely rewarded in the ways people imagined. There was no public redemption arc, no collective apology, no clean ending. What existed instead was continuity, the daily choice to speak carefully, to listen fully, to refuse erasure. She had tried to change the convent and been removed. The city had turned its back on her. Still, she remained, not defined by what had rejected her, but by what she continued to build quietly alongside others. And in that steady persistence, Agnes found not resolution, but meaning. Agnes became increasingly aware that the absence of crisis was itself a kind of test. There were no urgent emails now, no sudden controversies demanding response. The work continued quietly, steadily, without the sharp edges that once kept her alert. She understood the danger in that calm. Systems often waited for momentum to dissipate, for attention to wander. Endurance, she reminded herself, mattered most when nothing seemed to be happening. She adjusted her focus accordingly. Less energy went into reacting, more into strengthening what already existed. She helped formalize peer support circles, ensuring they could function independently of any single figure. She encouraged shared facilitation, rotating leadership, collective decision-making. The goal was resilience, not visibility. Institutions collapsed movements by isolating leaders. Agnes had no intention of becoming indispensable. The university study progressed toward publication. Drafts circulated, revisions debated. Agnes noticed how easily language softened as it passed through committees. Harm became challenge. Silence became complexity. Power imbalance became organizational culture. She pushed back gently but firmly, insisting on precision. Words, she knew, were not neutral. They shaped what readers were allowed to see. The final text retained enough clarity to matter, even if it unsettled fewer people than it could have. She was invited to review a policy proposal from a large nonprofit unrelated to religion. As she read it, familiar patterns emerged. Accountability mechanisms without enforcement, reporting pathways without protection, transparency without consequence. Agnes wrote detailed feedback, highlighting these gaps. The response was polite, appreciative, non-committal. She did not expect more. She had learned that institutions often solicited critique to demonstrate openness, not to enact change. Still, the act of naming mattered. Even ignored feedback left a trace. Clara called one evening, her voice unsteady. She had started a new job and found herself instinctively shrinking in meetings, apologizing before speaking. Agnes listened, recognizing the pattern immediately. They talked about how deeply obedience trained the body, not just the mind. Awareness, Agnes said, did not erase conditioning overnight. It required patience, repetition, kindness toward oneself. Clara exhaled audibly, as if relieved to hear that struggle did not mean failure. These conversations reminded Agnes that harm lingered long after structures were left behind. Leaving an institution did not free someone from its logic. That logic lived on in habits, fears, reflexes. Advocacy that ignored this internal dimension risked reproducing harm in new forms. Agnes emphasized this increasingly in her work, insisting that resistance included healing, not just exposure. The advocacy group received news that one of their early contributors had withdrawn publicly, citing personal reasons. Rumors followed. Some speculated about pressure. Others accused betrayal. Agnes addressed the group calmly. She reminded them that survival sometimes required retreat. Not everyone could sustain visibility indefinitely. Movements that punished withdrawal mirrored the systems they opposed. The group absorbed this quietly, adjusting without condemnation. Agnes noticed that her own relationship to recognition had shifted. Early on, being dismissed or criticized had stung sharply. Now, praise unsettled her more. Applause risked simplifying work that was complex, collective, unfinished. She deflected attention toward process rather than personality, redirecting credit whenever possible. She had learned how easily individuals became symbols, and how quickly symbols were discarded when they no longer served. She attended a small retreat focused on contemplative practice, unsure whether it would resonate. The silence was structured but gentle, unlike the enforced quiet of convent life. Agnes found herself unexpectedly moved. Silence, she realized, was not inherently oppressive. It became so when imposed to erase voice rather than deepen it. Chosen silence felt different, restorative. She carried that distinction back with her, more attuned to nuance. During the retreat, she reflected on the word obedience, once central to her identity. She traced its roots, its uses, its distortions. Obedience, she concluded, was not inherently wrong. It became harmful when severed from mutual accountability. When obedience flowed only downward, it ceased to be moral and became mechanical. That insight clarified much of what she had lived. The church announced a regional initiative aimed at retaining women in religious life. Agnes read the announcement with interest. The language emphasized mentorship, belonging, vocation. Missing entirely was discussion of power. She shared the document with colleagues, pointing out the omission. Some nodded knowingly. Others shrugged. Change, Agnes thought, often stalled at the edge of power analysis. Many preferred solutions that preserved hierarchy intact. A journalist reached out again, proposing a follow-up piece focused on long-term impact. Agnes declined politely. She had grown wary of narratives that framed resistance as arc with beginning, conflict, and resolution. Real change did not fit that structure. It unfolded unevenly, often invisibly. Compressing it into story risked distortion. She offered instead to connect the journalist with multiple voices, decentralizing the focus. Whether that would be pursued remained uncertain. Financial uncertainty resurfaced when a grant ended unexpectedly. Agnes felt the familiar tightening but responded pragmatically. She adjusted her schedule, reduced expenses, accepted temporary consulting work. Precarity, she knew, was another pressure point systems exploited. Stability mattered. She did not romanticize struggle. Sustainability required material grounding. One afternoon, Agnes received a letter from a woman still living in Hollow Creek. The letter was unsigned, cautious. It thanked Agnes for speaking when others could not. It said nothing had changed outwardly, but something had shifted internally. People whispered now, questioned quietly. The letter ended abruptly, as if written in haste. Agnes held it for a long time. This, she realized, was how impact often appeared, not as reform, but as interruption. She did not respond, not because she did not care, but because response might endanger the writer. Boundaries, too, were part of care. Agnes tucked the letter away, carrying its weight without needing to act on it. As another year progressed, Agnes felt less urgency to define her role. She was no longer a former nun, nor merely an advocate. Labels felt insufficient. She existed in a space between identities, shaped more by practice than title. That ambiguity once frightened her. Now it felt honest. She reflected on how much her understanding of courage had evolved. Courage was no longer the act of speaking once, dramatically. It was the decision to keep speaking carefully, even when the world moved on. It was the refusal to simplify complexity for comfort. It was the patience to build what could last, rather than demand what would not come. Agnes had tried to change the convent and been removed. The city had turned its back on her. Still, she remained, not frozen in opposition, not chasing validation, but inhabiting a steady refusal to disappear. And in that refusal, renewed daily without spectacle, she understood that resistance was not a phase of her life. It was the shape it had taken. Agnes began to sense that the most enduring changes were happening beyond her direct view. She heard about them secondhand, through fragments and implications rather than reports. A policy quietly revised here, a supervisor challenged there, a woman who chose to document instead of dismiss. These were not victories she could claim. They did not belong to her. That, she realized, was precisely why they mattered. Change that required attribution was fragile. Change that dispersed itself survived longer. Her own role shifted again, subtly. She spoke less often in public forums and more frequently in private conversations. People came to her not for answers, but for calibration. To ask whether what they were experiencing was real, whether they were imagining patterns that felt too familiar to ignore. Agnes listened and reflected their observations back to them without judgment. Naming reality, she had learned, was often enough to disrupt its power. The advocacy group reached a crossroads when internal disagreements surfaced more openly. Some members felt the pace was too slow, the approach too cautious. Others feared that acceleration would invite retaliation they were not prepared to withstand. Agnes recognized both impulses. She facilitated conversations carefully, insisting that disagreement itself was not failure. What mattered was how it was held. The group chose to remain intact, accepting tension rather than forcing consensus. That decision preserved trust, even if it slowed progress. Agnes noticed how often urgency masqueraded as moral clarity. She had once believed that wanting change badly enough could make it happen faster. Experience had corrected that assumption. Urgency without structure led to collapse. Patience without truth led to stagnation. Holding both was the real work, and it demanded more discipline than either, alone. She continued her collaboration with researchers, reviewing revised drafts and methodological notes. The work was meticulous, sometimes frustrating. Agnes found herself advocating repeatedly for the inclusion of lived experience alongside quantitative analysis. Numbers, she argued, demonstrated scale. Stories demonstrated cost. Without both, harm remained abstract. The team listened, though not always easily. Academia, like any institution, protected its norms. A former colleague from the Convent reached out unexpectedly. The message was brief, cautious, almost formal. She said she had been thinking about Agnes often, that she had not agreed with her at the time, that she was not sure she agreed even now. But something had unsettled her since Agnes left, a discomfort she could not name. Agnes read the message several times. She responded gently without argument. She thanked her for writing. She said uncertainty was not disloyalty. It was awareness beginning to form. That exchange stayed with Agnes. She realized that dissent did not always persuade. Sometimes it planted questions that took years to surface. The system relied on immediate conformity. It struggled with delayed reckoning. Seeds took time. That did not make them weak. Agnes attended a small workshop on restorative practices, curious but cautious. Much of the language resonated. Some of it felt premature. Restoration without acknowledgement of harm risked becoming another form of erasure. She voiced this concern carefully. Others nodded. The facilitator adjusted the conversation. Agnes appreciated that. Not all spaces resisted critique. Some welcomed it as part of integrity. Her personal life grew slowly, deliberately. Friendships deepened outside the work. She allowed herself to be known in ways that had nothing to do with advocacy or faith. Laughter returned, unforced. This mattered more than she had anticipated. Systems isolated dissenters by narrowing their identities. Agnes resisted that narrowing by cultivating joy where she could. Joy, she learned, was not distraction. It was resilience. Financial stability remained uneven but manageable. Agnes accepted that precarity might always accompany her path. She no longer interpreted it as punishment or proof of error. It was a condition of choosing work that did not serve dominant interests. She planned carefully, saved when possible, rested when necessary. Survival was not shameful. It was strategic. Clara continued to navigate her new life, uncertain but increasingly grounded. She spoke of moments when she caught herself deferring automatically, then corrected course. These small acts felt monumental to her. Agnes celebrated them quietly. Liberation, she knew, was not dramatic. It was cumulative. The city Agnes now lived in began to feel less provisional. She did not mistake familiarity for acceptance. But she had carved out a life that did not depend on approval. That distinction mattered. She no longer asked whether she belonged. She asked whether she was present. One afternoon, Agnes revisited her earliest notes from Hollow Creek, copies she had reconstructed from memory after her journal was taken. The handwriting felt distant, almost belonging to someone else. She noticed how tentative the language had been, how careful. She did not judge that version of herself. She honored her. That caution had been necessary then. Courage grew in stages. The church announced another restructuring, another initiative promising renewal. Agnes did not read the details. She had learned that proximity to such announcements drained energy without yielding clarity. Her work no longer revolved around response. It revolved around construction. Building alternatives, however modest, felt more generative than critiquing declarations that changed little. She received an invitation to facilitate a closed dialogue between women from different institutions. No press, no records. Agnes agreed, setting clear boundaries. The meeting was tense at first, filled with hesitations and coded language. Slowly, as trust built, clarity emerged. Patterns were named, grief surfaced, anger followed. Agnes did not direct the conversation. She held it. That, she realized, was her role more often now, creating containers where truth could exist without being immediately managed. Afterward, several women lingered, reluctant to leave the space. Agnes recognized that feeling. Spaces where one could speak freely were rare. She reminded them gently that the goal was not to replace one dependency with another. They needed many such spaces, not just one. Decentralization again. Always. That evening, Agnes walked home alone, reflecting on how far she had moved from the question that once haunted her: whether faith required silence. She now knew the answer intimately. Faith required discernment. Silence chosen freely could be holy. Silence imposed to protect power never was. The city that had turned its back on her still existed, unchanged in many ways. The convent still stood somewhere beyond her daily horizon. Agnes did not feel drawn to either. Her life no longer orbited around rejection. It orbited around practice, She understood now that resistance did not mean constant opposition. It meant refusing to internalize the logic that harm was inevitable or justified. It meant building differently, even when scale was small, especially then. Agnes had tried to change the convent and been removed. The city had turned its back on her. Still, she remained, not fixed in grievance, not seeking return, but committed to a way of living that would not betray what she had learned. And in that commitment, renewed quietly each day, she found not triumph, but steadiness. A steadiness that no system had been able to take from her. Agnes entered a season where the work felt less like movement and more like maintenance. The initial urgency had passed, replaced by something quieter and more demanding. Continuity without recognition. She understood now that many systems did not collapse because they were challenged, but because they were neglected long enough to lose legitimacy. Her task was not to dismantle them directly. It was to keep building something else alongside them until their authority no longer felt inevitable. She spent more time mentoring than speaking publicly. Younger women, newly aware and uncertain, reached out cautiously. They did not ask how to fight. They asked how to endure without disappearing. Agnes listened carefully, aware that advice could easily become another hierarchy. She spoke instead about boundaries, about pacing, about refusing the lie that suffering proved devotion. She reminded them that leaving was not the only form of resistance, and staying was not the same as consenting. Discernment mattered more than optics. The advocacy group shifted its focus toward long-term sustainability. They developed internal guidelines for leadership rotation, conflict resolution, and rest. Agnes supported these efforts strongly. She had seen too many movements fracture under the weight of unexamined power. Good intentions were not immunity. Without structure, even resistance reproduced harm. The group's slower pace frustrated some, but it also allowed trust to deepen. Trust, Agnes knew, was the rarest currency. A request arrived from a small religious community seeking consultation. Agnes hesitated. She had grown wary of invitations framed as openness that masked self-preservation. After careful consideration, she agreed under strict conditions. No public statements, no institutional endorsement, only internal conversation. She spoke plainly, naming dynamics without accusation. Some listened closely, others defended reflexively. Agnes expected both. Change rarely arrived evenly. What mattered was that the conversation had occurred at all. Afterward, she felt a familiar fatigue, not physical, but existential. Engaging institutions always carried that cost. Even when done carefully, it required emotional translation, constant vigilance. Agnes took time away afterward, honoring the need for recovery. She had learned that burnout did not announce itself dramatically. It accumulated quietly, disguised as dedication. Clara continued to find her footing outside religious life. She spoke of moments when old reflexes resurfaced, when she felt the urge to submit preemptively. Agnes reassured her that healing was not linear. Conditioning dissolved unevenly. Awareness did not erase habit overnight. What mattered was noticing, choosing again. Clara's voice sounded steadier each time they spoke. Agnes reflected often on the concept of vocation. Once, she had understood it as obedience to a calling defined externally. Now, vocation felt more like alignment, a practice rather than a destination. She no longer asked whether she was doing the right work. She asked whether her work allowed her to remain honest. That question guided her more reliably than any approval ever had. The church's presence faded further into the background of her daily life. She was no longer consulted as a former insider. She was referenced occasionally as an external critic, sometimes neutrally, sometimes dismissively. Agnes accepted this with equanimity. Distance had clarified her role. She was not there to reform the institution. She was there to support those navigating it. She noticed how often people still waited for institutional validation before trusting their own experience. Agnes challenged this gently, reminding them that authority did not grant reality. Lived experience did. Naming harm did not require permission. It required courage and support. She helped build that support quietly, person by person. One evening, Agnes received news that a woman she had once supported had spoken publicly and faced immediate retaliation. The familiar anger surfaced sharply. Agnes reached out, offering connection to legal and emotional resources. She did not promise justice. She promised accompaniment. That distinction mattered. Too many had been abandoned after speaking. Agnes refused to replicate that pattern. This incident renewed her awareness of risk. Systems adapted constantly, refining their methods. Retaliation grew more subtle, more procedural. Agnes updated training materials accordingly, emphasizing documentation, networks, and self-protection. Resistance required evolution. Stagnation made it vulnerable. Her own life remained modest, grounded. She moved apartments, found a place with more light, more quiet. The small changes mattered. She cultivated routines that nourished rather than depleted her. Cooking, walking, reading without agenda. These were not escapes. They were maintenance. She understood now that sustainability was an ethical choice. Agnes thought less often of Hollow Creek, though it never disappeared entirely. It lived on as reference, not wound. She wondered sometimes how the town remembered her, if at all. She suspected she had become a cautionary tale, then a footnote. That no longer troubled her. Erasure had lost its power once she stopped seeking recognition from those who erased her. A younger advocate asked her whether she still believed change was possible. Agnes considered the question carefully. She said she believed harm could be interrupted, even if it could not be eliminated. That fewer people could be made to suffer in silence. That dignity could be reclaimed in small, cumulative ways. That was enough. As another year approached its end, Agnes felt neither accomplished nor defeated. She felt steady. Her life no longer revolved around proving anything. It revolved around showing up where it mattered and stepping back where it did not. Discernment, she realized, was a lifelong practice. She had tried to change the convent and been removed. The city had turned its back on her. Still, she remained not in opposition, not in nostalgia, but in motion. Her faith no longer depended on belonging to a structure. It depended on fidelity to what she had learned. And in that fidelity, renewed daily without ceremony, Agnes found something quieter than vindication and stronger than approval. She found a way to live without disappearing, even when the world would have preferred she had. Agnes came to understand that longevity itself was a form of defiance. Not dramatic endurance, not heroic suffering, but the simple refusal to vanish over time. Systems expected critics to burn out, move on, soften, or be absorbed into something quieter. Remaining present year after year unsettled that expectation. Agnes no longer underestimated how much power lived in consistency. Her work entered another phase, one marked by succession rather than expansion. She began preparing others to take on responsibilities she had once carried alone. This was not withdrawal. It was multiplication. She knew too well how movements collapsed when knowledge remained. Concentrated. She documented processes, shared contacts, explained decisions she had once made intuitively. Transparency, she insisted, was protection. Some resisted this shift. They worried that dispersing leadership would dilute impact. Agnes disagreed gently. Centralization created targets. Decentralization created resilience. Institutions knew how to neutralize individuals. They struggled to dismantle networks that did not rely on a single figure. Agnes had learned that lesson painfully, early. She accepted fewer direct requests for help, redirecting people towards shared resources. At first, this felt like abandonment. Then she saw its effect. Women began supporting one another without mediation. Conversations expanded laterally. Authority loosened. This, Agnes realized, was how dependency gave way to agency. The academic study was published at last. It generated measured discussion, careful critique, polite interest. No upheaval followed. Agnes did not expect one. What mattered was that the research existed now, referenced, cited, impossible to fully erase. Institutions could ignore it, but they could not claim ignorance forever. Knowledge, once formalized, lingered stubbornly. Agnes attended a small symposium where the study was discussed. She listened as experts debated terminology and implications. When asked to comment, she spoke briefly. She reminded the room that the most significant impact of the work would not be visible there. It would appear quietly, in decisions made differently, in doubts that could no longer be dismissed as isolated. Some nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. Agnes was familiar with both responses. Her personal faith continued to evolve without urgency. She no longer sought communities that mirrored what she had lost. She sought practices that sustained her. Meditation, walking prayer, reading texts once forbidden to her because they questioned authority. Faith, she discovered, expanded when it was no longer constrained by fear of disobedience. There were moments when memory resurfaced unexpectedly. A phrase spoken in a meeting, a tone of voice, a rule enforced without explanation. Her body responded before her mind did, tightening, bracing. Agnes learned to recognize these moments not as weakness, but as information. Trauma lived in pattern recognition. Healing required patience with that truth. She spoke openly about this now, especially with women who blame themselves for lingering fear. Conditioning, she reminded them, was rational adaptation to unsafe environments. Unlearning it took time. Self-compassion was not indulgence, it was repair. Clara visited again, more grounded than before. She spoke of building a life slowly, of discovering preferences she had never been allowed to name. They laughed together, genuinely. Agnes noticed how much lighter Clara seemed. This did not erase what had been lost, but it affirmed what was possible. Seeing that mattered. Agnes also saw how easily people wanted narratives of recovery, stories that moved from harm to healing cleanly, efficiently. She resisted that framing whenever it surfaced. Healing was not linear. Some days felt expansive. Others contracted unexpectedly. Both belonged to the truth. Simplifying that truth made it palatable, but false. The advocacy group faced another challenge when a high-profile case drew public attention. Media interest surged briefly, chaotic and demanding. Agnes advised caution. Survivors were not raw, material for awareness. Protection came first. The group limited engagement, issued careful statements, refused sensationalism. The attention faded quickly. The work remained. Agnes felt a quiet pride in that restraint. Years earlier, she might have chased momentum. Now she recognized how easily urgency became exploitation. Ethical resistance required limits, even when opportunity beckoned. Her financial situation stabilized modestly through consulting and teaching. She accepted this without apology. Work aligned with values still deserved compensation. Poverty, she had learned, was often romanticized to keep people compliant. Choosing sustainability was not betrayal. It was wisdom. Occasionally, Agnes wondered whether the church would ever reach out differently, not with invitations to dialogue, but with accountability. She did not dwell on the possibility. Hope, she had learned, could be tethered to action rather than expectation. She placed her hope where she had agency. She received another letter from Hollow Creek, this time unsigned but unmistakably cautious. It spoke of quiet shifts, of women supporting one another discreetly, of questions that no longer felt unthinkable. Agnes read it slowly. This, she realized, was the closest thing to change she might ever see there. Not reform, but interruption. The system still stood. Its certainty had cracked. She did not respond. She knew better now than to insert herself where presence might endanger others. Influence did not require proximity. Sometimes distance was the safer gift. Agnes reflected on how far she had come from the woman who once believed obedience was the highest form of faith. She did not judge that version of herself. She honored her sincerity. Obedience had been a language she knew then. Discernment was the language she spoke now. The city that had turned its back on her still existed in her memory as a place that could not bear to look. She no longer needed it to. Her life had expanded, beyond its gaze. She was not defined by rejection anymore. She was defined by continuity. As she prepared for the next season, uncertain but steady, Agnes understood something essential. Resistance was not loud by default. It did not always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looked like staying, sometimes like leaving, sometimes like building quietly, where no one was watching. She had tried to change the convent and been removed. The city had turned its back on her. Still, she remained. Not frozen in opposition, not chasing reconciliation, but committed to a way of living that refused erasure. And in that commitment, sustained patiently over time, Agnes had found something the system could not touch. Not victory, not approval, but a durable freedom rooted in truth. Agnes noticed that as years passed, the question of legitimacy surfaced in quieter ways. No one asked outright whether she had been right. Instead, people asked whether what she was doing counted. Counted as ministry, as faith, as contribution. The question carried an assumption she recognized immediately. That meaning required institutional validation. Agnes did not answer directly. She asked instead what people meant by counting, who decided, who benefited. The conversations often stalled there, not from hostility, but from unfamiliarity. Many had never been invited to examine those assumptions. Her work increasingly involved helping people disentangle identity from permission. This was slow, delicate labor. Authority left residue. Even when structures were left behind, their logic lingered. Agnes spoke often about this, framing it not as failure, but as evidence of how deeply systems shaped the self. Unlearning was not a rejection of faith or commitment. It was a refinement of them. The advocacy network continued to decentralize. New facilitators emerged, confident, thoughtful, unwilling to replicate hierarchy. Agnes took satisfaction in this, though it required restraint. There were moments she could have intervened more decisively, imposed clarity, resolved tension quickly. She chose instead to trust process. Control created efficiency. Trust created durability. The difference mattered. A regional conference invited her to give a keynote on ethical leadership. Agnes declined the keynote and offered to participate in a panel instead. The organizers hesitated, then agreed. She understood their disappointment. Keynotes elevated individuals. Panels distributed voice. That distribution aligned more closely with what she believed. On stage, she spoke briefly, emphasizing that leadership without mechanisms for accountability was not ethical, no matter how benevolent its language. The applause was polite. The discomfort palpable. Agnes left early, content. The church announced another cycle of renewal, accompanied by new language emphasizing humility and listening. Agnes read the announcement without reaction. She had learned to distinguish between rhetorical humility and structural humility. One involved tone, The other involved surrendering power. The latter remained absent. She did not comment publicly. Silence, chosen deliberately, could also be a form of refusal. Clara sent a message describing a moment at her new job when she had challenged a decision calmly and been taken seriously. The experience surprised her. She admitted she had expected punishment. Agnes smiled when she read it. Conditioning did not disappear overnight, but reality sometimes contradicted fear. Those moments mattered. They reprogrammed expectation. Agnes herself experienced such moments more often now. People listened to her without dismissiveness. Her perspective was sought not as confession but as expertise. She remained cautious. Professionalization brought legitimacy, but also risked sanitizing critique. She navigated this carefully, maintaining clarity even when language around her softened. A journalist published a retrospective on institutional accountability movements, mentioning Agnes only briefly, almost in passing. She noticed the omission without resentment. Movements matured when they no longer required founders to remain central. Her absence from the narrative felt appropriate. Influence did not always need attribution. There were days when fatigue returned unexpectedly, not the sharp exhaustion of crisis, but the dull weight of repetition. Agnes honored those days differently now. She rested without guilt. She trusted that. Stepping back temporarily did not undo years of work. Consistency, she had learned, included knowing when to pause. She continued to meet privately with small groups, holding space for conversations that could not happen elsewhere. These gatherings remained unpublicized, intentionally so. They functioned as laboratories of honesty. Agnes observed how quickly people spoke once safety was established, how much they had carried alone. She did not offer solutions. She offered containment. That was often enough. The city where she lived changed gradually, imperceptibly. New people arrived. Old dynamics shifted. Agnes no longer felt watched. She felt known, in fragments. That partial recognition suited her. Total visibility had never been safe. Partial visibility allowed movement. She revisited her earliest understanding of faith again, noticing how far it had traveled. Faith had once been obedience, then resistance, then discernment. Now it felt like attentiveness, to harm, to power, to conscience. Attentiveness demanded humility, not submission. It required staying awake to reality, even when reality was inconvenient. Agnes received another unsigned letter from Hollow Creek. This one spoke of someone leaving quietly, of another requesting transfer, of conversations that happened late at night behind closed doors. The tone was cautious, hopeful, restrained. Agnes felt no triumph, only gravity. Change there would be slow, uneven, costly. She knew better than to romanticize it. She placed the letter with the others, a small archive of interruption, proof that silence was no longer total. That mattered. As the seasons turned again, Agnes reflected on how resistance had reshaped her sense of time. She no longer measured progress by milestones. She measured it by continuity, by whether conversations that once felt impossible now occurred, by whether fewer people blamed themselves for harm imposed by structure. These were subtle shifts. They endured. She was asked once whether she would ever return to institutional life if conditions changed. Agnes answered honestly. She said return was not her goal. Transformation did not require reversal. She had built a life oriented toward truth outside those walls. Returning would not make it more valid. It would only make it more familiar to others. That answer surprised some. Many assumed healing required restoration. Agnes understood why. Restoration offered symmetry, but symmetry was not justice. Sometimes healing meant moving forward without resolution, accepting that truth had consequences and choosing not to erase them for comfort. The convent, the city, The system that had turned its back on her still existed somewhere beyond her daily horizon. Agnes did not carry them as burdens anymore. They were reference points, not anchors. She had tried to change the convent and been removed. The city had turned its back on her. Still she remained, not waiting for acknowledgement, not hoping for reversal, but grounded in a way of living that did not require permission. And in that groundedness, sustained without spectacle or certainty, Agnes understood that the deepest challenge to any system was not opposition alone. It was the quiet proof that life could be lived differently, honestly, and without erasure. Agnes found herself thinking more often about endings, not as conclusions, but as thresholds. She had learned that stories rarely closed neatly, especially those involving power. Instead, they thinned out, widened, or shifted direction. What once felt central receded. What once seemed peripheral took on weight. The work she had begun no longer belonged to a single chapter of her life. It had become a condition she carried like awareness, like memory. She noticed how people who met her now rarely asked about Hollow Creek directly. They had heard fragments, enough to understand context without requiring detail. The absence of questions felt respectful rather than dismissive. Agnes appreciated that. She had grown tired of recounting origins. Origin stories simplified trajectories that were anything but linear. She preferred to speak about practice, about how one lived after disruption, not just how it began. The Advocacy Network marked an anniversary quietly, without celebration. A few years had passed since its formation. No banners, no statements, just a shared acknowledgement among those involved. Agnes saw wisdom in that restraint. Commemoration often froze movements into symbols. They preferred continuity to nostalgia. The work did not need to be remembered. It needed to be done. Agnes herself felt less compelled to articulate her position within conversations. She no longer introduced herself through opposition or history. She spoke from where she stood now. This unsettled some people who expected a clear stance, a fixed identity. Agnes accepted the ambiguity. Fixed identities were easy to manage. Fluid ones resisted containment. She spent more time listening than speaking. In listening, she heard how deeply institutional logic shaped everyday decisions. People deferred instinctively, apologized reflexively, second-guessed perceptions. Agnes did not correct these habits directly. She asked questions instead. What made you doubt that? Who benefits if you stay silent? What would happen if you trusted what you noticed? These questions lingered longer than advice ever could. A former bishop published a memoir that brushed lightly against themes Agnes recognized. The book framed reform as a matter of tone rather than structure. It praised humility without examining hierarchy. Some people asked Agnes what she thought. She said she thought memoirs often told the truth the author was prepared to face. No more, no less. That answer satisfied some and frustrated others. Agnes did not elaborate. Clara continued to build a life that no longer required translation. She spoke with less hesitation, more clarity. Agnes noticed how often Clara laughed now, a sound that had once been rare. They met for long walks, discussing ordinary things. This ordinariness felt like achievement. Healing was not dramatic. It was cumulative. Agnes herself allowed her life to widen beyond the work. She traveled briefly, not to escape, but to remember scale. She visited places where no one knew her story. The anonymity felt restorative. It reminded her that she existed beyond conflict, beyond narrative. She returned grounded, less reactive, more present. The church issued another statement responding to a public scandal unrelated to her work. Agnes read it once, then set it aside. The language followed a familiar pattern: condemnation of wrongdoing, commitment to values, promise of review. The structure remained intact. She felt no anger, only recognition. The system was consistent, if nothing else. A young woman wrote to Agnes describing fear of becoming invisible if she stayed silent and fear of becoming isolated if she spoke. Agnes responded carefully. She did not minimize the risk. She acknowledged it fully. Then she wrote that isolation imposed by others was not the same as solitude chosen in integrity. One wounded, the other could sustain. The difference mattered. That distinction stayed with Agnes as she reflected on her own journey. She had been isolated by the city, erased by the convent. That isolation had harmed her. What she lived now was solitude, deliberate and porous. She chose when to engage and when to withdraw. That choice had restored something essential. Agnes noticed that she no longer felt urgency to defend herself against misinterpretation. If people misunderstood her work, she allowed it. Understanding could not be forced. Those who needed clarity would find it. Others would move on. She conserved energy for what could be shaped, not what could only be contested. The archive of letters she kept grew slowly. She did not reread them often. They were not trophies. They were reminders. Proof that interruption had occurred. Proof that silence had been breached, even if quietly. She kept them not to validate herself, but to remember responsibility. Words, once spoken, carried obligation. She was invited to advise on the formation of a new initiative focused on ethical accountability. Agnes agreed to an initial conversation, then stepped back. She resisted the pull to build endlessly. Knowing when to let others lead was as important as beginning. Overextension diluted presence. She had learned that lesson through fatigue. As time passed, Agnes felt less defined by what she resisted and more by what she practiced. Attentiveness, care, boundaries. These were not dramatic virtues. They were reliable ones. They did not dismantle systems overnight. They created spaces where alternative ways of living could take root. She thought again of Hollow Creek, not as a wound, but as a marker, a place that revealed what obedience without accountability produced. She did not wish it ill. She did not wish it redemption either. She accepted it as part of a larger pattern that extended far beyond one town or one convent. The city that had turned its back on her had done so to protect itself. Agnes understood that now without bitterness. Systems often mistook refusal to comply for threat. Threats demanded distance. Distance preserved comfort. That logic remained intact. What had changed was her relationship to it. Agnes no longer needed the city to turn back. She no longer needed acknowledgement from the convent. Her life did not orbit those absences anymore. It had found its own center. She had tried to change the convent and been removed. The city had turned its back on her. Still, she remained, not suspended in struggle, not defined by opposition, but rooted in a way of living that refused disappearance. And as she looked ahead, without certainty but without fear, Agnes understood that the most radical act she had committed was not speaking once, or leaving once, or resisting once. It was continuing to live with clarity, continuing to choose integrity, continuing without permission. In a world structured to reward silence and forgetfulness, that continuity was not small. It was everything. Agnes sensed that she was approaching a different kind of edge, one not marked by conflict but by transition. The work no longer demanded her constant presence, and that realization felt both relieving and unsettling. For years, purpose had been tied to urgency, to response, to resistance. Now much of what she had helped build functioned without her direct involvement. Networks sustained themselves. Conversations continued in rooms she never entered. This was success of a quiet kind, though it did not announce itself as such. She reflected on how systems failed not only through abuse, but through over-reliance on individuals. They burned people out, then replaced them, repeating the cycle. Agnes had been careful not to reproduce that pattern. Letting go was part of the work. Refusing indispensability was an ethical choice. Still, releasing responsibility carried grief. There was loss even in healthy endings. Agnes began declining invitations more often, not out of fatigue but discernment. She asked herself whether her presence added clarity or simply familiarity. Sometimes the answer surprised her. Being known could be as limiting as being silenced. Familiar voices were easier to manage. New voices disrupted more effectively. Agnes learned to step aside when stepping aside served the work better than speaking. She spent time writing privately again, not for publication, not for advocacy, but for integration. These pages were different from her early journals. They were less urgent, less defensive. She wrote about memory, about how certain moments lingered without narrative, about how power shaped the body long after the mind understood it. Writing, once resistance, now felt like maintenance of self. The city around her continued its slow transformation, unrelated to her story. New buildings rose, old businesses closed, people moved in and out. Agnes found comfort in this ordinariness. It reminded her that no single struggle defined the world. Context mattered. Perspective mattered. The danger was not forgetting injustice, but believing it was the only thing that existed. Clara called one evening to share news that she had been promoted. The joy in her voice was unguarded. Agnes congratulated her warmly, recognizing how significant the moment was. Advancement without self-erasure. Authority without submission. These milestones mattered, even if they went unnoticed by those who once dictated Clara's life. Agnes felt a quiet pride, not in herself, but in the possibility that survival could lead somewhere new. Agnes herself contemplated changes she had postponed for years: travel, study, teaching more formally, not as escape, but as expansion. She realized that staying forever in a posture of resistance risked narrowing her world. Resistance had opened her eyes. It did not have to confine her future. She allowed herself to imagine a life that included joy without justification. The advocacy group marked another internal transition, welcoming new leadership formally. Agnes attended the meeting as a participant rather than guide. She spoke when asked, listened otherwise. Watching others lead with competence and care brought unexpected relief. The work would continue. It did, not require her constant vigilance anymore. That knowledge softened something tight inside her. The church released yet another statement, this one referencing accountability frameworks that resembled work Agnes had once contributed to indirectly. The acknowledgement was vague, unattributed. Agnes noticed it, then let it go. Influence did not always come with credit. Sometimes it arrived stripped of origin. She accepted that without resentment. Change rarely thanked those who made it possible. She revisited the archive of letters one afternoon, reading them slowly. Some voices sounded urgent, others cautious, some hopeful, others resigned. Together, they told a story not of resolution, but of interruption. Silence had not been total. That mattered. She closed the box carefully, understanding that these stories were not hers to resolve, only to honor. Agnes noticed that she spoke less often about faith now, at least explicitly, not because it mattered less, but because it had become implicit, woven into how she lived rather than how she explained herself. Faith no longer needed defense. It was visible in practice, in restraint, in attention, in refusal to exploit suffering for meaning. She attended a lecture one evening where a speaker described moral courage as the willingness to stand alone. Agnes listened thoughtfully. She disagreed quietly. Standing alone was sometimes necessary, But it was not the goal. The goal was to make solitude unnecessary, to build conditions where people did not have to choose between integrity and belonging. That work was slower, less dramatic, and far more demanding. Agnes thought again of Hollow Creek, not with longing or anger, but with realism. It had been one place among many shaped by the same logic. Leaving it had not ended the pattern. Naming it had not dismantled it. But something essential had shifted. The inevitability had cracked. The idea that things could not be otherwise had been challenged. That challenge endured, even if quietly. She considered how the city had turned its back on her, and how that rejection had once felt like erasure. Now it felt like distance, and distance had become perspective. Being turned away had forced her to build elsewhere. That building had reshaped her life in ways she could not have imagined then. Agnes recognized that she was no longer driven by the need to be believed. She was driven by the need to be faithful to what she had seen. Belief from others was welcome, but not required. That shift had freed her more than any vindication could have. She received a message from a woman she had not heard from in years, thanking her for something Agnes barely remembered saying. The message was simple, almost casual. Agnes smiled. Impact was rarely traceable. One never knew which words lodged, which moments mattered. The work required trust without feedback. As she prepared to make changes in her own life, Agnes did so without drama. No announcement, no declaration. She had learned that transitions did not require spectacle. They required honesty. She allowed herself to move toward what nourished her without framing it as departure from anything else. The convent, the city, the system that had turned its back on her remained part of her history, not her horizon. She did not need to outrun them. She had already moved beyond their reach by refusing to organize her life around their judgment. She had tried to change the convent and been removed. The city had turned its back on her. Still, she remained, not suspended in opposition, not frozen in purpose, but evolving. And in that evolution, Agnes understood that the truest measure of her resistance was not what she had opposed, but what she had made possible. Lives lived with more clarity, choices made with less fear. Silence broken, not loudly, but enough. That was not an ending. It was a continuation, and she stepped into it without needing anyone to watch. Agnes understood, as she stepped into the shape of a life no longer defined by resistance alone, that continuation did not mean resolution. There would be no final scene where everything aligned, where the past was redeemed neatly and the harm fully repaired. What existed instead was coherence. Her life now made sense to her, even if it never would to those who had turned away. She moved forward without ceremony. The changes she had contemplated unfolded quietly. She accepted a teaching role that allowed her to work with people learning, to name power, language, and responsibility for the first time. She traveled occasionally, choosing places where anonymity felt like rest rather than erasure. She continued advising when asked, stepping in and out of spaces without needing to anchor herself to any one role. Flexibility, once forbidden, had become a form of freedom. The advocacy network functioned steadily, no longer oriented around growth or visibility. It existed as infrastructure, not spectacle. Agnes watched from a respectful distance, offering insight when requested, trusting the systems they had built together. This trust felt like closure of a different kind, not an ending, but a handoff. The work would continue without her vigilance. That mattered. She reflected often on how her understanding of power had matured. Power was not simply held by those at the top. It moved through habits, assumptions, fears. It lived in what people accepted without question and what they learned to doubt. Resistance, therefore, was not only refusal, it was re-education of attention. teaching oneself and others to notice what had once been invisible. Faith, once central and rigid, now felt spacious. Agnes prayed less formally, but more honestly. She no longer asked for permission or reassurance. She asked for steadiness, for attentiveness, for the capacity to remain present without becoming hardened. Faith had ceased to be a shelter from conflict. It had become a companion within it. She noticed that the memories of Hollow Creek no longer arrived with sharp edges. They came softened by time, stripped of urgency, carrying information rather than pain. She could recall the stone walls, the bells, the rules, without her body bracing. Healing, she realized, was not forgetting. It was remembering without being overwhelmed. The city that had turned its back on her had lost its grip on her nervous system. That was no small thing. Agnes did not return to Hollow Creek. She did not seek reconciliation with the convent. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. Returning would not repair what had happened. It would only reopen dynamics that no longer defined her. She had learned that some distances were not failures. They were boundaries that protected growth. Occasionally, she heard news in fragments. Another transfer. Another quiet departure. Another initiative announced with careful language. Agnes listened without urgency. She no longer expected institutions to surprise her. Consistency, even when disappointing, offered its own kind of honesty. She kept the archive of letters in a small box, tucked away but not hidden. She did not reread them often. Their presence mattered more than their content now. They reminded her that silence had been interrupted, even if only partially. That interruption could not be undone. Once people saw differently, they could not unsee. Systems relied on unseeing. That reliance had been disrupted. Agnes noticed that when people spoke to her now, they rarely framed her as brave. They described her as steady. The word pleased her more than she expected. Bravery suggested exception. Steadiness suggested practice. Practice could be shared. That distinction mattered. She thought again of the young woman she had been, arriving in Hollow Creek believing that obedience was the highest form of love. She did not reject that version of herself. She held her gently. That woman had loved sincerely. She had done the best she could with what she understood then. Growth did not require condemnation of one's former self. It required integration. The world around Agnes continued to shift in ways both connected and unrelated to her story. New conversations emerged. Old ones faded. Progress appeared unevenly. She resisted the urge to interpret everything through the lens of her own journey. The world was larger than her harm. Remembering that kept her from becoming trapped by it. She learned to recognize when to speak and when to remain quiet. Silence, once imposed, now belonged to her. She chose it when it served care, when it protected others, when it preserved energy. This silence was not erasure. It was agency. On an ordinary afternoon, Agnes sat by a window, light falling across the floor, and realized she felt no need to justify her life. Not to institutions, not to critics, not even to herself. The work she had done, the choices she had made, the costs she had paid, all formed a coherent arc. It was not perfect. It was honest. She understood then that the most profound shift had not been external. It had been internal. She no longer organized her worth around acceptance or rejection. She no longer waited to be seen. She had learned how to see herself clearly and how to stand in that clarity without demanding agreement. The convent had not changed in the ways she once hoped. The city had not turned back. The system still existed, largely intact. And yet, something essential had changed. Agnes had changed, and through her, others had learned to question, to notice, to refuse silence as default. That influence did not require institutional recognition. It existed in practice, in conversation, in lives adjusted quietly. She had tried to change the convent and been removed. The city had turned its back on her. Still, she remained, not as a symbol, not as a martyr, not as a cautionary tale, but as a woman who had learned to live without disappearing. Her story did not end with triumph or defeat. It ended with continuity, with a life, shaped by discernment rather than obedience, by truth rather than approval, by care rather than control. And in a world that depended on women absorbing harm quietly, that continuity was enough. It always had been,